Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan, and welcome to the Influence Continuum. I have a very special guest today, Jeffrey Augustine, and we go back a whole bunch of years, and I've been begging him to research and share knowledge because he's not only a journalist, but he's also a PI. I'm just going to read a little intro for you, Jeffrey. You're investigative journalist, and your blog is, drumroll, the Scientology Money Project. Very important blog that covers Scientology's money, crimes, lies, and legal matters. Augustine covers Scientology in real time, offers in-depth analysis, legal and government documents, and court cases. Augustine reports on the pervasive culture of white-collar criminality and financial scams within Scientology perpetrated by its members, in addition to Scientology's cover-ups of rapes and child molestation. Augustine has appeared on Leah Remini's double Emmy show Scientology in the Aftermath, and you've been quoted by a billion sources. And one example of your research into very, very sophisticated things was your exposure of the $1.8 billion, that's right, $1 billion GPB Capital Holdings Ponzi scheme operated by the now criminally indicted New York Scientologist David Gentili. I want to hear more about that perhaps, but this segment is, I really wanted to do this recording with you today, Jeff, because you wrote a very important in-depth piece on what I've been calling cult apologists or cult defenders. In your piece, you went further and said this is a cult propagandist, this man named Intravigne out of Cessner.org. And like he's kind of the head of all of these cult defender propagandists. So I'm super psyched and welcome to the Influence Continuum, Jeff.
I've been a long fan of your work. And as you said, we go back a long way. I think your work has influenced my way of thinking, helped shape me, and I appreciate what you do to educate the public. Your bite model is tremendous.
Thank you.
Basically, we're going to talk about what my article's entitled "The Cult of Cult Apologists," Massimo Intravigne, Part 1. Now, Massimo, we'll call him. Yes.
By the way, I have to interrupt, Jeff. I love the title, The Cult of So, because I've been called like the cult of the anti-cult. So I love your use of words on this one. So yeah, forgive me for interrupting.
The reason I thought of the title is if you look at what I call the cult apologists, they're an interlocking syndicate of scholars. And so let me connect a couple dots. I grew up in the Pentecostal church. I attended Christian University, Vanguard University here in Southern California. And I grew up in the era of Walter Martin, the Bible Answer Man. And during the Jesus People movement, I went to Calvary Chapel when I was in the tent. So I have all the Jesus person credentials. And
Yeah, and Walter Martin wrote Kingdom of the Cults, which was a theologically based critique of every other group that wasn't Orthodox Christianity from his theological perspective.
I met Dr. Martin many times. I attended his classes when I was a young man. Before I left the Pentecostal church, I wanted to be the next Bible Answer Man. And I even, as a side note, his son... we graduated from the same class at university. So, but
wow. And didn't you also mention to me that Frank Schaeffer was someone that you grew up on? And when I said, "Oh, I'm planning to interview his son, Frank Schaeffer," you were like,
exactly.
Whoa.
By way of history, there was a reaction beginning in the 1970s within the Assemblies of God that we were viewed as uneducated redneck hillbillies, snake handlers, tongue talkers. And there was a stereotype, so the Assemblies of God really amped it up intellectually. Vanguard University, which was then called Southern California College, was a very difficult college in terms of the academic requirements. For example, one of my professors, the late Dr. Pope Budge, wrote his doctoral thesis in 3 dead languages. Dr. Williams actually translated and wrote parts of new Bible editions that were coming out. Dr. Murray Dempster was a heavyweight in the Assemblies of God as a theologian. Many people came from Fuller Seminary, and that was so I went to school with a lot of people who went on to become key influencers in the political movement and the GOP. That's one reason I left. I became really disaffected with the idea that if you were a Christian, you had to be a Republican. I'll leave that aside. I just didn't like the politicization of the gospel. So,
and when you were involved, were they into Christian nationalism and dominionism, like taking over the government like it is now?
When I was in college, I read, even though I didn't have to, I read Francis Schaeffer. His first book, How Shall We Then Live, was the first book of his I read. And that was sort of my introduction that the kingdom of God had to be incarnated on earth. That it wasn't just a kingdom in heaven, but we wanted real political power to affect change in the United States government, the United States military. And the view then, and it's fair to say it's I understood it, and as I saw it expressed, the moral majority began with Jerry Falwell. And this was, we're not going to take all this hippie stuff, all this free love, all the drugs. We want Christian culture in America. Pat Buchanan declared a culture war. So there was the rise of Jan and Paul Crouch, who, whatever you think of them, they built a juggernaut of a global television network to help get this message out of what you'd call dominion theology. And where we're going to go back into the interview today, at the core of this whole Christian dominionism, Francis Schaeffer, amped up, weaponized Pentecostalism, was the idea of apologetics, which from the formal Greek is to be able to make a reasoned defense for your faith, why you believe what you believe. Right. So that was the demand on us. We had to articulate a formal apologetic of our version of the Christian faith. And you had to be able to argue why the Trinity was a valid doctrine. Classic Christianity, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ, very formal doctrine. And I studied the Pauline epistles, the Christology of John versus the Christology of Matthew, Mark, Luke, Greek, Hebrew.
So I want to do another interview with you all about this because it's so important. But would you mind if I interrupt your flow and just say I really would like to cover this incredible article, which we will have a link to on the Scientology Money Project about Massimo Intravigne and
and this
cult propagandists.
Will make the jump. So the reason I emphasize, we had to have a heavy grounding in apologetics. Now, after I left the Christian church at age 21, because I just didn't want to go to Fuller Seminary, and I did not really accept the propositions of the Bible as the inerrant Word of God, etc., I explored Eastern religions. One of my clients, I left the church. I became a technical writer at Hughes Aircraft. I had top secret clearances. So I go from a church boy to being a technical writer working on weapons in a Cold War environment, which is quite jarring. But it also showed me massive U.S. military power linked to Christian doctrine could be quite menacing. Because there were so many Christians in the U.S. military. And that was evident from many of my coworkers who were Christian. And so I got to see that, and that's something not everyone gets to see. Now, one of
Yes,
so
for
I
sure.
left Hughes after 3 years. I went into technical sales because I needed you could make more money. Company car, benefits, expense account, 401k. There was just a lot more money to be made making the jump into sales. And I was good at sales anyway. I'd sold at Radio Shack in college and made a lot of money selling the early TRS-80s. I made a lot of money. So one of my clients turned out to be a Scientologist, and he had helped me quite a bit. He worked for LAPD as a civilian communications supervisor. Very, very bright guy, very intelligent, very nice. And we got on the topic of past lives. And we used to talk about spirituality when we'd go out to lunch there. He worked at Piper Technical Center, which is an LAPD fortress off the 101. So he said, "Why don't you go, try some things in Scientology?" And I thought, why not, right?
Can I ask what year that was? I'm just for our listeners' sake. Okay.
84, right in there. So he was an OT7 at the time. And okay, well,
explain to our listeners what OT7 means.
It's a degree system like Freemasonry, if you will. And you begin at the bottom with grade 0. You move up the lower bridge, which are called the grades, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you become clear. You attain the state of clear where you no longer have your active mind. Then you go into the operating thetan levels. Thetan being a spirit. That's Scientology's word for spirit is thetan. It's not thetan, it's thetan. Rhymes with Satan. Well, Arnie Lerman used
you couldn't help that, right? I hear you.
Funny.
Arnie is a now deceased friend who was a very big activist, whistleblower about Scientology.
Brilliant mind.
Yeah, and sure. I want to interrupt. Forgive me, but just the public has this incorrect perception that only weak and stupid people get into cults. And everything you've said so far is the counter to that. Everyone who knows me and my work knows that's absurd, and who knows John Atack. Really brilliant people can get lied to and have their minds hacked.
Let's go on that just keep going. A minute. I just did a blog post on the Scientology Money Project. Now, Bob Duggan is Scientology's billionaire. He was smart enough to start, or he purchased a very nothing pharmaceutical company many years ago, Pharmacyclics, and he was smart enough to hire scientists, the right people, researchers, serious, hardcore scientific people, and he managed the money in Wall Street. But he let the scientists do the heavy lifting who are not Scientologists. He didn't infuse the company. Well, they made a breakthrough in a cancer drug, and Bob Duggan, Scientologist, OT8, done everything you can in Scientology. Long term, he sold that company to AbbVie for $3.2 billion. So, yes, very intelligent, sophisticated people. Now,
So he's what we call a whale who has been funding the cult, right?
$300 million, maybe $400 million. Now, he got divorced from his wife, Trish. I just did a story on one of the most, Trish Duggan's money manager. It's on my blog. And he's a very sophisticated financial manager who, runs a hedge fund. Very educated, sophisticated guy. So my point is there are very sophisticated people in all all religions. And so that's the first thing you want to get out of the way is there are very sophisticated people. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier, the Pentecostal church I was in, the Assemblies of God, did not want to be viewed as anti-intellectual or redneck hillbillies. We wanted to be hardcore apologists bringing forth the kingdom of God on earth, being able, and a lot of us were encouraged to go to graduate school or become lawyers or to do some real heavy lifting for the faith.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I'll give you, let me just make a detour here for your audience. Back then, rapture mania was going on. There was the belief that the rapture would happen by 1981. That was Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth. Founding of Israel, 1948.
Yeah, I remember
it
that.
couldn't go beyond 40 years. Pre-tribulation rapture, 1981 had to be it. So when I graduated high school in 1975, a lot of my friends were not going to college because they said, well, the rapture is happening, so why bother?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go to...
Sounds like Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, Armageddon's coming, so we don't go to college.
Debt and do everything else. Why not? World's ending tomorrow. So, Dr. Billy Graham, to his credit, was asked, should young people go to college? He said, you'll be more effective for Christ if you go to college, even if the rapture's occurring. So I took Dr. Graham's advice and went to college. Also, my dad said, you got a free scholarship. If you don't take it, he was a high school dropout, but a brilliant man in his own right. He, brilliant machinist, tool and die maker. He said, if you don't go to college, I'll break your arm. He wasn't serious, but he said, look, you got a free scholarship here. You're going to take it. You're going to make something of yourself. So anyway, what my point is, when my friend invited me to do some Scientology courses, I did some Scientology courses. And the first thing I noticed when I started reading Scientology books, I said, where are their apologetics? Where do they explain what Scientology is? Because I knew they were using public relations. But if I actually had questions, they would always tell you to read Dianetics, which I read Dianetics and it made no sense.
You got through it? That's amazing. So
look,
many
I read
people
theology
never could read
texts, dense theological tomes on the formal Christology of the Gospel of John, so I could do this stuff, right? But when I read Hubbard, it was like there's no defense of the faith. You're just told there's this reactive mind, and he uses words like analyzer and particle flows. It's like this is so poorly written. And I had converted my degree from biblical studies to English literature in order to salvage my degree, because if I transferred to University of California, Irvine, I'd lose a lot of Bible credits. So my point being is I didn't see any apologetics in Scientology. I also, if you'd come to my Christian church, we would give you a free Bible. We would invite you to potluck, to church meeting. There, they wanted my credit card. In fact, my first reg cycle was they wanted $12,000 for life repair.
So Scientology wanted money up front.
I remember my first I had to do that personality test.
Which is called the Oxford Personality Test. It has nothing to do with Oxford and has no scientific validity at all. But great for a recruiting tool to say, we can help you.
Yeah, the Oxford capacity analysis.
These problems.
But here's where it comes in. Okay. When I got my security checks or my security clearances from the Department of Defense, I had to be polygraphed by the FBI and the Department of Defense. And they asked me questions in the cohort. Are you a communist? Are you a homosexual? Do you belong to John Birch Society? Blah, blah. They asked me all these questions, right? So when I go to Scientology, because I'd had security clearances, that made me technically illegal as a member. They don't allow journalists, policemen, intelligence. If you've had clearances, there are a lot of people called illegal pre-clears. You can't have Scientology. But I had some value to them with my technical abilities in fiber optics and things. They were wanted to consult on as a sales engineer. So they did, after I did my Oxford capacity test, my personality test, and I was waiting for that process, they were going to analyze the test or something, which it's already predetermined, but they, let you set a while, think it's going through some high-level computer and analysts or something. But I had to go on the e-meter to do a security check.
Right.
And I got asked the exact same questions. Are you a communist? Are you a homosexual? But they also said, have you been sent in by law enforcement or an intelligence agency? It's like, no, I'm just curious. And what was...
Mm-hmm. And for our listeners, I just want to say the e-meter is a pseudoscientific version of a bad lie detector where you hold these cans and supposedly there's a needle that measures your skin
it measures,
conductivity.
So I was on the
anyway,
e-meter, which
keep
measures
going.
galvanic skin resistance. And I have a paper on my blog I wrote during COVID, which I like. I should link it. So I'm being asked these questions,
Sure.
right? Now it was almost it's parts of it were funny because I get asked, do you have any evil thoughts or purposes on L. Ron Hubbard? I said, no, I don't even know him. I read the book, but no. And they said, do you have any evil thoughts or purposes on Mary Sue Hubbard? I said, who's Mary Sue Hubbard? She said, the Commodore's wife. I said, who's the Commodore? L. Ron Hubbard. And I said, how is he a Commodore? They said, from the Sea Org. And I go, what's the Sea Org?
Right.
And they go, stop it. I go, no, I don't know. Right. I mean, I don't know anything about Scientology. And they're throwing around a lot of the terminology. So my whole point is, I noticed that they do not have apologetics. Coming from a religious background, that's like religion 101, have in-house apologists. Even the Jehovah's Witnesses had apologists. The Latter-day Saints have apologists. Everyone, Islam has apologists. Those defenders of the faith, the scholars, the imams, the patrician citations in the Christian church, that's the writings of the early church fathers. So this singular absence, it was all L. Ron Hubbard. That stood out to me as a red flag. So let's fast forward into the 90s on the bulletin board ARS, Alt Religion Scientology.
So that's the beginning of the internet.
Yeah,
and there was modems, this
and this was an internet
list.
Bulletin board.
Right.
I started reading about what are called New Religious Movement Scholars, NRM, New Religious Movement Scholars. And how this came about, it coincided with the sarin gas attacks on the Tokyo subways. Yes.
Oh, Shinrikyo. 60 Minutes flew me to Tokyo to be their expert on site after that attack.
That's really was a big revelation because that's when I came across the name J. Gordon Melton, religious scholar.
Because he was flown over there, right, to defend it, the cult.
Okay, now, I'm working in scientific lighting. By profession, I'm a scientific lighting expert. And I won't go into all that, but I know a lot about lasers, lighting, spectrophotometers, blah, 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 blah. So these two religious scholars, James Lewis and J. Gordon Melton, go over to defend Shinrikyo. And I know, as religious scholars, because I had religious scholars as professors, that they know nothing about chemical manufacturing, biotoxins, bioterror. They're not equipped to make any assessment on this thing. You would need spectrophotometers, chemical experts, weapons grade. You need serious people to do it. And I'm thinking, why the hell are religious scholars saying that this cult could not have made sarin gas? Oh, yes, they are certainly capable of it. Because
So I want to interrupt again, if I may, for our listeners. These so-called scholars are typically sociologists of religion, and we're going to get into their propagandizing, but I would argue, and I think you would too, because I did my doctoral dissertation, I did a deep dive into the literature review, and I saw so many bogus articles by these people purporting to be writing, peer-reviewed journal articles, and they were just horribly biased.
So what I
did,
back to you, is I did some research, and I got David Bromley. He wrote a book. He was the early guy. He's written against.
He wrote against me.
David Bromley and Anson Shoup in the early 80s started this whole thing. J. Gordon Melton with new religious movements. Now, going back to my Hughes aircraft days, we had briefings from intelligence officers that sensitized us to Soviet propaganda. Okay. So I knew what Soviet era propaganda was, how it was used, and I read books on Soviet propaganda on my own. So when I started reading Bromley's book, I'm wait a minute, these are dangerous cults, and you're relabeling them as new religious movements. That's
Exactly. It was a rebrand to try to like make
because
them
I had read
okay.
Fawn Brody's work on Joseph Smith and the Mormons. In fact, I had read terrific book,
Great
and
book.
I had read quite a bit
Great
of
book.
on the Millerites and how the Jehovah's Witnesses began, because that was very interesting when I was in church. It was part of required reading in apologetics. Why are the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses not Christian? They don't hold to the doctrine of the Trinity. Here's how they began, blah, blah, blah. Watchtower Bible Tract Society. Well, also coupled with the study of Soviet era Cold War propaganda, I knew right away this was propaganda. And they were trying to call, I realized then that Scientology, it answered my question when I read Bromley's work and that of J. Gordon Melton and the other cult apologists, that the Church of Scientology was not capable. It didn't have PhDs. Hubbard hated PhDs, even though he called himself Dr. Hubbard. He hated the whole academic world because it had rebuffed him in the 1950s, early 1950s.
Didn't he claim in somewhere, Jeff, that he got a PhD in nuclear physics?
In fact, he wrote that he was a nuclear physicist.
And he was a pulp science fiction writer, right? Who was a bigamist and involved with Crowley's cult.
When Dianetics came out, he thought it would sell 15,000 copies, and be a thing, but it blew up. It went viral. It was a bestseller, right? When it was released on May 9, 1950. So suddenly Hubbard needed a biography. And so he said he had been in all 5 theaters of war. First casualty of World War II returned on the Secretary of the Navy's private plane. He had been a nuclear physicist. He was a civil engineer. He just claimed a lot of stuff he wasn't. But that was to sell Scientology as, written by a nuclear physicist and a decorated war hero. Oh my gosh, that's impressive. He studied the science of the mind using the principles of physics. So, that's the
BS,
story for
in other
time.
words. Total BS.
But because there were no PhDs within Scientology Sea Org, which is their paramilitary clergy, right?
Well, you sign a billion-year contract in the Sea Org, and you basically work forever for no pay.
What functions as their clergy is actually kind of a radicalized paramilitary group. Now, their public members, there are some PhDs.
Yes.
In fact, the CIA's remote viewing program had some former Scientologists, Hal Puthoff, Ingo Swann, in it. Just going back to the fact there are sophisticated people. And so the CIA remote viewing program called Stargate had some former Scientologists. Yeah. Let's go back to
let's go back to our topic.
These new religious movement scholars, Scientology had outsourced the apologetic burden onto them. But Scientology, true to form, said you can't talk about the upper levels with Xenu and body thetans and all that. You can't really talk about it. So what you're going to do is do propaganda and call it apologetics. So Bromley...
Yeah, and you can't talk to ex-members or critics either.
The architecture created by Bromley, Shoup, Melton, and others, they kind of laid out a very simplistic formula, but it was very weaponized. The first thing Bromley did that I think is so intellectually dishonest is to call former members apostates and claim that it's a neutral term. Now, I know damn well from having been in the Pentecostal church, one of the worst things you could be called is an apostate, because apostates, God's wrath will be poured out upon them. That's true in Islam and in Christianity. So it was an offensive, weaponized term. It was full of malice.
Yep.
To call a former member of a church an apostate is malicious. It is a form of very hostile propaganda. It dehumanizes former members.
Right.
It devalues their testimony. And in fact, the cult apologists say that former members have no validity in their testimony of what went on. They have an inherent bias. They don't. If I've interviewed hundreds of former Scientologists from the very top of the hierarchy, to low-level public members. I've done 90 plus podcasts. And this is all valuable eyewitness stuff that would be admitted in a court of law. As a private investigator, I say that. Because when I'm working on a case, I have to look at what would be admissible in court. And I do work with attorneys. So some things that's hearsay you discount.
Sure.
Some things that's just private resentment you discount. What's actually evidence? So as a private investigator, I know what evidence is and what something that's anecdotal is, right? But I also know, working with Scientology, I know what propaganda is. So they begin by saying, because cults hate to be called cults. And what I always tell journalists, if you don't want to be called a cult, then don't act like a cult.
Yeah, the old version of walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, has feathers like a duck. But don't call me a duck, call me a swan.
And so,
please.
The other thing, while I was in business, I noted I was developing a good mind for organizational structure, money, legal matters, because I dealt with patents pending, non-disclosure agreements, intellectual property, and I was always working with our legal staff, right? And I looked at we studied organizations and organizational behavior, because I worked mainly for Phillips and Siemens, those two big companies, business to business sales.
And those are big ones.
Lighting divisions, and we would sell to other large corporations. So you had to study the psychology of organizations as part of sales and influence. And how do organizations who are the decision makers study their stock, their ownership, their key to... So I kind of was getting my mind around all this. And the reason I mentioned studying corporate, I had to be successful in a large corporation, you have to know how the organization works. And that's not trivial. That can take several years to understand how a corporation functions. To optimize your own performance, you have to know who to call to get stuff done. Like, we have a shipment stuck in Salina, Kansas at our factory. There's a snowstorm. We don't want to shut down, a manufacturing facility. And I did sell to manufacturers in LA. So can I cross-dock traffic through, take some stock from, another warehouse and cross-dock it, logistics, everything. So when you're looking at the organization, I saw that this cult of cult apologists were functioning exactly like an organization, exactly like a corporation.
Cessnur.org, CESNUR.org. Isn't that Intravenia's organization?
Intravenia is a lawyer by training. And as I understand, he's a sociologist. He calls himself, but he's not a PhD. He's an undergrad in sociology. So he basically is a lawyer, and this is where he's sneaky. He puts together a corporation. He puts together a publication, the Cheshire Journal. I've heard it pronounced in, forgive me, Massimo, I've heard it pronounced both ways. Cessnur, Cheshire.
Yeah, I've been calling it Cessnur all these years, but it might be different because it's Italian.
So anyway, he puts together a journal, and they're writing papers defending cults. That's their business model. If you're a cult...
And not only defending, if I can interrupt for a second, not just defending cults, but saying brainwashing doesn't exist. There's no such thing as mind control.
I mean, that's where we're going to get.
Okay, sorry. I jumped the gun.
No, the first thing they do is they devalue and dehumanize former members. And in any kind of war, the first thing you're going to do is take out your key members. Okay, so when you have high-level people who've left a cult like Mike Rinder.
So Mike Rinder was number 3 in the Cult of Scientology, who left and has been being whistleblowing ever since. And he has a show with Leah
whenever
Remini
you have high-ranking former,
go on.
He does.
Doesn't Mike have a book coming out soon? I think
he does have a book coming out.
Okay.
So
look forward to that. Back to you.
In a war,
Sorry,
what
Jeff.
you're going to take out is command, control, communication, C3, right? So the command, you're going to take them out. We're seeing this with Ukraine killing all the Russian generals. Ukraine is specifically targeting Russian commanders in the field. Okay, so cult apologists will go after high-level influential former members, and they will launch what are called fair game attacks, character assassination, outright lies. And they'll say, well, as academics, they're using their academic authority to say these people have no validity. In fact, Massimo cited a book he said where there's an academic, I don't have the reference handy, but I will get it posted on my blog. He cites a scholar who said the study of cults has no validity. And this is a guy out of a university in Missouri. He's saying the study of cults has no validity. I'm thinking, wait, you're some guy in Missouri. You're not at Yale or Harvard, and you're a sociologist. You know, who are you to say that? Are you like? This is the thing about cult apologists and their arrogance. Massimo Introvigne said that the critics, former members, have not succeeded in academia. Well, does he speak for the entire academic world? No. He's talking about his cloistered little club of cult apologists like Eileen Barker.
Yes, one of my favorites, who said the Moonies don't do brainwashing or mind control, and essentially have called me a liar all these decades.
Let's go on. 3 steps. Former members are apostate, their testimonies to be disregarded, when in fact their testimony is often the most valuable, and they have documents, and they're willing to go to court. Secondly, they're new religious movements and not cults. Now, okay, you can see where they're going. But the third thing that you spoke of, and this is Massimo Introvigne has been saying this for decades. Brainwashing does not exist. In fact, I predict when he dies and passes away, he'll probably put that on his tombstone. Brainwashing does not exist. Now, brainwashing is a shorthand term for a very complex constellation of things that go on to influence people in religious cults. It's
any type of mind control cult.
Shorthand term that came into use in the 1950s. So Massimo Introvigne has created a straw man called brainwashing. He sets up this simple thing, and they try to talk about stuff from the 1950s in the North Korea. Brainwashing, they didn't know how to describe it. They didn't have the language. Back then, they didn't have the sophisticated language we have now that has ties into neurobiology, mind control. They just didn't have it, so brainwashing fit something they didn't fully understand. You know, aspirin they didn't understand for over 100 years why it really worked. They didn't understand flight. Yeah, well, the same thing with airplanes. They knew about lift, but they didn't. So things that exist take time to develop, like an understanding of gravity, right? So with brainwashing, Massimo's setting up a straw horse and saying, well, in the 1950s, it was described as some magical way the North Koreans had to change your mind. And he makes it a really simplistic construct, and then he knocks it down as a straw man.
Right. So we need to explain to our listeners the straw man fallacy.
You have the PhD.
Do you want to do it, or you want me to do it?
I'm a layman.
Ha ha ha. So what these cult defenders, these apologists have been saying is they create a false definition that brainwashing is 100% effective on 100% of people forever. And so they create this straw man and then blow it down by saying, well, people leave. So that means that there's no such thing as brainwashing, for example. So it's a false construct that's used to, in a sense, divert people's attention and to, change the definitions of things in order to act as if they know what they're talking about when they don't.
The straw man fallacy is used by new religious scholars, as they call themselves, or cult apologists, to say the minute you say brainwashing, everything you say thereafter is invalid on its face. So once you use the word brainwashing, we get to dismiss and ignore you. And I'm not going to play their game. In fact, they're playing a game we're not playing. We're not playing that game. They don't understand at the level of Western culture. When you look at what's gone on, I cited a study on my blog post we talked about in which the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, along with the U.S. Defense Department, released a 2012 study on cyber on the brain, the effects of cyber neurobiology and cyber psychology on political extremism. And they showed a very sophisticated model of radicalization, which I think what cults do to people is they radicalize them.
Of course, they create a new identity that's extremist and dependent on the cult.
And this is a very sophisticated thing that, that you can do gradually, depending on the person. You radicalize them. And it wasn't until after I had to deal with leaving.
Exactly.
Look, the Pentecostal church I was in, the Assemblies of God, was a very high pressure control group. Classic thought stopping, classic indoctrination, threats of going to hell.
Phobia, indoctrination. Yep.
I was terrified.
Yep. And demon possession
16,
everywhere,
I participated in an exorcism. And it was the most intense thing I'd been through while I was 16.
Did they try to exorcise you, or you were there and watched them try to do it to someone else, or what?
An interesting excursion I want to take. Just allow me a few minutes. There was a thing called the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association. Demas Shakrian.
I remember.
So they were having a meeting up in a church camp in San Bernardino Mountains up here where I lived. I'm born and raised Los Angeles, right? And so I was a youth leader in the Jesus People movement at my high school. In fact, I was senior class president. Faith fellowship. I was a youth leader. So the Full Gospel Businessmen invited me up because they wanted a few Jesus people up there, right? And this was actually really phenomenal. I'd hair down on my shoulders like I do now. And so I went with two of my friends, and we were like the token Jesus people. But all the
didn't Jesus presumably wear long hair?
And so I was.
And a lot of these cults say you have to have short hair. You can't have hair touching the top of your ears.
It's funny because when I got there,
where is that in the Bible?
Everybody was older, right? And this Kenneth Copeland was the speaker. He was still on the rise. I got to spend an hour talking to him on a hike in the mountains.
Wow.
He is the most intense person. Wow. He's amazing in some ways. Riveting, right? But that's a story for a different time. But when I get to the Full Gospel Businessmen's Convention at church camp, the Southern preacher sees me and goes, son, you got long hair. He said, the Bible says it's a shame if a man has long hair. I said, but Jesus had long hair. He goes, well, two things. They don't have scissors back then. He goes, but I'll tell you, if God can't see the back of your neck, he can't hear your prayers.
I love the accent, Jeff, too. It's great.
Yeah.
It's called legalism, right, Jeff? Where they add things to the Bible and make rules that if you disobey
I countered
them,
by saying,
then you're
the
in
Bible
trouble.
also says, blessed is the man who doesn't condemn himself in the things which he allows. And he was blown away that I knew the scriptures, right? Because I did know my Bible. I knew my Bible. King James Version, 1611. I know it like the back of my hand still. So anyway, there's this like, Kenneth Copeland speaking, God's man of faith and power, unleash your power, blah, people speaking in tongues, miracle healings. So on this side thing, it's like a different room. I go in there and they're doing this exorcism. So this guy's on the floor and like 3 or 4 guys are trying to hold him down and he's screaming and foaming at the mouth and they just need more manpower, right? Like, hey, come here and help us hold this guy down. I don't know what to do.
Oh my God.
I'm 16. Wow. It's like, so they're speaking in tongues and this guy's screaming like a demon. It's like really intense because
I've done a lot of cases with victims of exorcisms in these cultic groups.
It was
traumatizing
really to watch it and not have any preparation for it because I'd heard about it, demonic oppression, demonic possession. But this fellow who claimed to have been a long-term, decades-long exorcist was, calling down the name of Jesus, pleading the blood, and this guy was convulsing, and I was helping hold him down. Then he relaxes. And he said, all the pain in my stomach I had for decades is gone. The demon has left. And this old exorcist told me, he said, I'll tell you this about being an exorcist. He goes, you don't have to be afraid of demons because you got the power of Jesus. You got the blood of Jesus, right? He goes, but, son, listen to me. He's also Southern. He said, when you get around anything that's big enough to move a refrigerator or larger objects, you get the hell out of there. He goes, because you got to bring back.
In other words, you don't attempt an exorcism on a 350-pound former linebacker. If a demon's
big enough to move a refrigerator, you get out and you get reinforcements, then come back with the whole crew. Well, you don't want a refrigerator falling on you. Exorcist dies, demon flings refrigerator on him. That's just not. Anyway, that's kind of comical, but it was very intense.
Yeah.
It was psychodrama, right? And it was traumatizing to me. Like, I don't know how to process this. But that's my reality that they're putting on me, is that this is scary stuff. I knew then I was never going to be an exorcist. Didn't care to have a career in it. And the movie The Exorcist had freaked me out like so many other people.
Well, that was used by the Moonies on me to install a phobia. We were literally taken to see the Exorcist movie, at least 100 of us in Greenwich Village at a movie theater. And then we went up to Tarrytown and Moon gave a lecture how God made this movie. And this movie is a prophecy of what would happen to us if we left the Unification Church.
That is really something.
Yeah. So that's when I stopped thinking and listening to any doubts that were happening in my head because I was so petrified of being possessed by demons.
Fear after that. Let's go back to radicalization.
Yep. Please, you were talking about the military saying this is a real thing. We've studied it.
After 9/11, the big question was, how do you get people to fly jetliners into high rises and kill thousands of people, slaughter them in cold blood? They have to be radicalized. So that became a study taken on by the Department of Defense, the FBI, and with a lot of scientists at the big universities, because there's obviously something going on. Now,
And they were middle-class Saudis, most of them, by the way, from nice families.
Correct.
Who did the suicide
I'm going to read from my blog. The processes
Yep.
of cultic, religious, and terroristic radicalization are described in the FBI radicalization framework as, quote, a dynamic, multi-tiered process involving multiple interacting factors that influence an individual. These factors range from personal level factors to the political and social context within which individuals find themselves. Radicalization and mobilization are neither linear processes nor are they necessarily permanent, unquote. Now, this is a sophisticated description of a complex process in which many forces interact to affect personality change. Now, conversely, the 1980s era, Massimo Intervenier, Bromley, New Religious Movement model doesn't come anywhere near the sophistication. In fact, it is a straw man argument. Because what we do in science, when I was working at the level of, say, a laser, we would benchmark our laser against the competition. So when you benchmark what we can produce in terms of a sophisticated explanation of how people are radicalized within cults, and we benchmark it against the cult apologists, their model just is shown to be an intellectual fraud. As is this guy in Missouri, his declaration that cults are not a valid area of study. Yes, they are. And you're not God, and you don't get to say what is and is not a valid area of study. The arrogance, Steve, you're an academic. What if someone said to you, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's not a valid area of study"? That's censorship. That's all it is. That goes back to the Catholics saying, "How dare you say that the earth orbits around the sun? We'll burn you at the stake." So so Scientology, going back earlier, Scientology and other cults have outsourced their apologetical function to people with PhD or sociology degrees to try to make it seem legitimate. And it's not legitimate what they do. So there are three predicates. Former members are apostates and should be disregarded. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Critics like
and
me
critics,
should
by
be
the
disregarded.
way.
Well, you're the worst.
Like me.
You're
Don't forget me.
A suppressive.
He really has written a lot of lies about me. He's really taken me on.
When I said earlier, you take out command control, communications. You're a very influential, high level.
Yeah.
Person with a lot of you're an academic
critic
with influence.
Yeah.
With important influence. You're a threat to cults. You can testify in court as an expert. So they have to target, whenever you're running a propaganda campaign, you're going to target the high profile leaders for character assassination. And that's why Massimo has to target you. Scientology and their cults say, take this guy out, degrade his influence, smear him, whatever means possible. And if you make it look intellectual, all the better, even though it's pseudo intellectual. Now,
but they'll take out journalists too, like my friend Paulette Cooper, scandal of Scientology. They fair game the hell out of her.
A very high level member of Scientology. She was the highest classed auditor.
Yes, very high.
Class 12K supervisor. My wife's Karen Della Carriere. She worked on the ship with L. Ron Hubbard. She would have the equivalent rank of a cardinal in the Catholic Church. Hubbard only made 7 class 12K supervisors. Karen was one. She's a former member, high ranking, who knows the innermost secrets of the OT levels, the L's, everything else. So they've targeted her. I have a hate page on me. In fact, they say that I'm a private investigator, and as such, my job is to investigate people who support Scientology. I don't know what it means. There was some kind of like attack, like, okay, so I know how to investigate, so I'm a threat to them. You mentioned earlier, I have for many years investigated the $1.8 billion Ponzi scheme led by Scientologist David Gentile, who was indicted by the Department of Justice. He's headed to criminal trial. I've investigated the pervasive white collar financial criminality within the church. There's a pervasive culture, and I report on it, and I use court documents. I use court testimony. The Danny Masterson, the actor, the Scientologist, has been charged with 3 counts of forcible rape in California, which carry an indeterminate sentence of 45 to life. 3 counts. He's heading into criminal trial in October. I'm going to cover that trial. They covered up Masterson's rapes, and it's more than 3 women. There are 3 women he charged, where other women will testify. So we're up
right. And these women were in Scientology, left, and then Scientology said, no, you can't bring a case against Masterson because you signed these contracts when you were in Scientology.
In fact, back in 2014,
did I get that right?
I was talking about these contracts of adhesion. You sign 4 basic contracts when you go into Scientology that strip you of your legal and human rights. You sign them as a condition of membership. I was talking to anyone who would listen. And they're posted on my blog. You go to the header, it's called the 4 Evil Scientology Contracts. So what I look at as a cult, and this is where the religious cult, the cult apologists have a role. My background gives me a unique perspective, okay?
I'd say you're very impressive, and really you've done the homework, and you don't say anything that's not true. You look at the facts, you go with the evidence, and you make the connections.
You have to have, and that's why Leah Remini's show was so successful. Right. She and Mike fact-checked everything. I say that the big cults, the Moonies, Scientologists, the big cults, they tend to become uncontrolled capitalism fused to extreme ideologies, and that becomes very dangerous. Scientology is fundamentally a wealth extraction scheme fused.
Yeah, you have to pay to go up the bridge to total freedom.
$1 million or more. Basically, they take all your money.
And by the way, people should know that Scientology did not have tax exemption status for over 25 years. And then they lied and defrauded the IRS and threatened to sue them and harass the commissioners and got
they lost
religious status all of a sudden.
Due to inurement by L. Ron Hubbard, and they regained it. And that's another podcast we could do. So Scientology runs an intelligence and espionage operation called the Office of Special Affairs, and Mike Rinder,
used to be the Guardian's office,
commanding officer of the Office of Special Affairs. So he speaks from a unique position of authority on what they do. He hired private investigators to stalk, harass, intimidate, threaten people. And I got to say, there's good PIs and bad PIs. Okay,
Yeah, but before you go on to the PIs, I just want to say I listened to Mike's podcast. I think Chris Shelton was involved, and Leah, and he said that he recruited someone from Oxford University very early on to be an apologist.
What the Office of Special Affairs does is it engages in public relations, legal matters, and intelligence. So Mike's book, which is going to be released, I believe, on October 11, it's called A Billion Years, My Escape from a Life in the Highest Ranks of Scientology. And he was the number 3 man. And this is published by Simon & Schuster.
Yep.
You guys are in
my publisher.
Company. So he's one of the highest ranking detectives. He was the number 3 man. There was David Miscavige, Marty Rathbun, Mike Rinder. So you have that level of testimony that would be admissible in court. He would be certified as an expert in court if he wanted to testify. Now, he said that he hired these cult apologists. They needed to create this perception tax exemption that they were in fact a religion. But because they lacked the apologetical skills, they don't have any in-house academics. They just don't have any. So if I had to write a formal,
Yep.
and I have written formally on Scientology's operating thetan levels, my description of what I think they are, what they do, right? I could, as a thought exercise, write an apologia for Scientology, just if I needed to. But that's training in a debate where you write both sides, right? Now, I think the cult apologists, because they do not understand Scientology at all, they're left to attack former members, say that brainwashing doesn't exist. Therefore, your attacks on Scientology, that Scientology brainwashes people, are invalid because brainwashing don't exist. That's a tautology. That's a circular argument. Look at how it goes in a circle. Brainwashing doesn't exist.
Correct.
If you say Scientology brainwashes people and brainwashing doesn't exist, then what you say is invalid. That's a tautology. That's just a BS tautology. I feel like saying, Massimo, you're a lawyer.
Yeah.
You know what you're doing. You're dishonest. You're really dishonest as a lawyer. You're a contemptible individual to boot, and you're attacking very good people. You know what evidence is. You know what's admissible in court. You should know better as a lawyer. And this is why I call him a rank cult apologist, because he is. He's a paid whore. And so as J. Gordon Melton. By the way, an odd curiosity, both J. Gordon Melton and Massimo Introvigne are really into vampires. No,
I'm not shocked. I knew about Melton,
yes, he was
but
like
I didn't
the
know
president of the
Introvigne
Transylvanian
was into
Society.
vampires.
And these guys, it's so interesting that they're into vampires, because that's kind of what they are on Scientology's behalf. They're vampire-like. It's just an odd curiosity. There's nothing, I mean, if they're into vampires, I don't get it, but it's just, it's.
Yeah, vampires don't exist, by the way, although there are TV series that are making a lot of money with people pretending to be vampires and vampire killers. But back to, I want to make an important point, because what Massimo Introvigne and this whole effort, they're saying that brainwashing doesn't exist, and therefore they're saying there's no political cults or therapy cults or controlling relationships or hypnosis. And we know Hubbard was a hypnotist.
In fact, what they would like to do, I've told a journalist that Massimo Introvigne has never met a cult he didn't like. Meaning, well, you know what?
Especially if they pay them.
They're paid cult apologists. Now, they can call it a stipend, expenses, etc., but they're paid by the, what was interesting with your Eileen Barker. Now, what I covered in my article, let me grab it here because we're going in so many directions, but Eileen Barker, she went to cover unification, the Moonies.
Something like 18 times at all these expensive conferences around the world.
Events. And the
17.
Reverend Moon
okay.
and his people paid her expenses.
Please don't call him Reverend, because he's not.
Okay,
just like Hubbard isn't a PhD.
Moon.
Sorry, I'm having fun now.
Unification Church, the Moonies, paid her expenses. Now, being a corporate guy like me, that would be a clear conflict of interest. You couldn't do it. There were things I couldn't do if it was a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
You can't do it. That would be like Big Tobacco paying all those phony scientists in the 50s to say that cigarette smoking is not harmful. That's what I look at these cult apologists are. They're the scientists of the 50s with tobacco companies paying to say smoking doesn't harm you. Brainwashing doesn't exist. Well, you pull back the curtain.
Right. I agree.
So Eileen Barker said, well, my school, and she worked for the London School of Economics, approved of it. Well, that doesn't mean...
Yeah, and they even got government money for a group called Inform that was saying, when families would come to her, I'm worried about my son in Scientology. She'd be like, no, he's an adult.
The point I make is she took this money. She said, well, my school said it was okay, but I write that is not saying much, because London School of Economics had also accepted £1.5 million donation from Muammar Gaddafi's son via the Gaddafi Foundation. So they were taking money from Muammar Gaddafi through his son, and his Muammar Gaddafi's son's dubious PhD, that was probably paid for it. London School of Economics also signed a £2.2 billion contract to train Libyan officials. Now, this is where it gets really sketchy, and I like London School of Economics, but schools go through bad administrations, so their director, Sir Howard Davies, was forced to resign over what's called the LSC Gaddafi scandal. So for Eileen Barker to say, well, my institution approved it, well, yeah, they took money from Gaddafi as well. So what's your argument, Eileen?
But I would add, because I did do a doctoral program, that in every article she writes, if she doesn't disclose potential conflicts of interest, like when I'm presenting at a major psychological conference, you have to say, are you getting money anywhere from anybody? And I say, well, I earned some from the sales of my books, but otherwise, no.
And in fact, that conflict of interest.
Right.
Look, again, that's why I draw the analogy to the scientists working for big tobacco saying smoking is not harmful. They're just going to say these aren't cults, they're new religious movements, and they're not harmful. So really, it's quite easy to blow through as a PI, as a critic, as an analyst. Massimo Introvigne has his journal, and CESNUR is an acronym for Center for Studies on New Religions. They've authored, I looked it up, 70 plus pro-Scientology articles. And they turn a blind eye to Scientology's flagrant human rights abuses, cover-ups of rape and child molestation. It's master race doctrine, which Scientology has a master race doctrine. It's called Homo Novus. Yeah.
As does the Moonies. The Koreans are the master race, by the way, if you didn't know that.
Massimo covers up its use of child labor and its violations of public policy, human rights. The interesting thing, because the OT levels are a trade secret, you know why Scientologists can't talk about the OT levels is because they sign a contract, saying they'll pay a $100,000 fine for damages if they talk about it. So before you're...
Yeah, and some of my friends and probably your friends who posted on the internet the OT levels got arrested for copyright violation, and they lost.
They were
and
raided.
Scientology won. And then Andreas put it up on Xenu.net over in Norway.
But here's what's interesting, and here's the tell. You know when you're playing poker, that term tell, you're looking at your opponent. Yeah,
you get a cue. A person's nervous, or they smile if they have a good hand. Is an obvious tell, right?
The tell is that he's never written about Xenu or the telepathic auditing of body thetans that Scientologists do on the OT level with the E-meter. Now, he can't write about their upper level mysticism. Now, this even assumes he knows about it or wants to know about it. The church would... Well,
I don't think he's allowed to know about it unless he does it and pays for it. No,
worked for the Office of Special Affairs for 5 years when she was married to Heber Jensch, the president of the church.
Oh, I was on a show opposite him, and he was attacking me as an evil deprogrammer back when the Time magazine did a cover story on the cult of greed about
Heber's
Scientology.
In OSA.
91.
And Karen... her opinion is that the church would never allow Massimo to see the OT course packs. And if he asked about Xenu and BTs, his OSA handlers would talk about generalities about exorcism, maybe. So look, if you're going to be a researcher, you need, in biblical studies at least, you need the earliest possible manuscripts. What is the earliest Gospel of John? What is the earliest Gospel of Luke, right? This is what textual critics do. You're going to need the source documents, as I mentioned, the writings of the church fathers. The fact that you would have a paid cult apologist not being allowed to look at your esoteric upper levels of mysticism and explain what you do. Massimo cannot be an authority on Scientology by default if he doesn't know the OT levels. That invalidates him.
Good point. I love that point.
I can
it's so
talk
true.
with a high level of expertise about the OT levels and what goes on. I know it.
Let's do it again, another podcast. But let's circle back because we're at 1 hour 10.
Is why I think he's a rank cult apologist, and this is I'll summarize this. The cult apologists are all Caucasian, all white scholars. They're all in their 70s or older. Massimo, I think, is the youngest at 67. There's a few new, younger replacements coming into the field, but basically new religious movement scholars. It's a very cloistered, self-referential, tautological world built on straw man, financed by cults. As a program, it's failed to move the needle out here in Western culture at all. In fact, Massimo has had to admit that the critics and former members have succeeded in mass media. That's because they're liars. They have no compelling message. People can see right through them, whereas we, former members, critics, experts, we have a compelling narrative with evidence, with documents, with the facts. We have something that media wants to hear, that documentarians like Alex Gibney has won Academy Awards, he's willing to put his money into to tell the story and expose it. And
but they cause great harm to members who believe this BS because it's part of the programmed propaganda.
So this is why they are fighting a battle that they're fighting a game that we're not even playing. We're not interested in. We're not interested. I'm not going to engage Massimo, but I do want to expose him and what he's doing, because as we go down, the shadow men, I call them, the men and women who have a vested interest in keeping the status quo in Scientology, who make money off the human suffering. Massimo doesn't care to end the human suffering in Scientology. He wants to profit from the status quo. He's a tired old academic who's peddling the same old tripe for decades now. And he needs to be exposed as a charlatan. And that's what I think he is. That's my opinion, is he's a charlatan.
And I thank you for doing this deep research and writing about it and being brave and courageous as you have been for so many years, speaking truth to power and, holding destructive criminal groups accountable, like Scientology.
It's sort of one of those things that, you take on in the work you've done. I admire. And you do it because sometimes I feel morally and spiritually obligated to do it, and I can do it. And
exactly. That's how I feel. I'm morally obligated to tell what I know because it happened to me. And I would have flown a plane into the World Trade Center when I was in the Moonies. That's how I was indoctrinated, to die on command or kill on command without hesitation.
That is
terrifying. I was a soldier for God. It really is. And when I got out, I was like, what happened to me? This is nothing like my childhood or my values. Wait a minute.
One of the most brilliant things that was ever said was said by Jason Begay, who, after he left the church, he said it in Alex Gibney's documentary, Going Clear. You take on a matrix of thought that is not your own. And that was so brilliant on Jason Begay's part to say, and it's so perfect. You take on... So you really get a plug-and-play identity system, is what I call it. They tell you who you are, what your purpose in life is. And we'll talk about on the next show the OT levels and the plug-and-play identity system.
Great. I would love to. And I want to do one with you, if you don't mind, on the whole New Apostolic Reformation and the whole Christian dominionist attacking democracy and wanting to impose their reality on us.
King James Bible, version 1611, which is the only Bible handed down from God. Disregard all others. I'm ready.
Oh, you're the man. Thank you, Jeffrey Augustine. We're going to let people know about the Scientology Money Project. read this article. You do incredible work. And say hi to Karen. And we'll talk again soon. Thank you so much.